Queens Public Library embraces the theme Pride, Not Prejudice as we celebrate the vibrant spectrum of the LGBTQ+ community. Join us this Pride Month for an empowering lineup of events, including author talks, films, pride crafts, and inclusive story times for families. At QPL, we believe in the power of diversity and acceptance, providing a welcoming space where everyone can find connection and community. Visit queenslib.org/Pride 2024 to learn more. Juneteenth commemorates the end of slavery in the United States. Join us in June as we celebrate this annual day of Jubilee all month long. Check out our reading lists and enjoy our in-person and virtual programs in honor of this important day in U.S. history. Learn more at queenslibrary.org. Summer is a time to read and explore together. Reading during the summer is not only fun, it's an important way for children to retain and improve their reading skills when they are not in school. Summer reading at QPL includes a wide range of resources and activities for kids and adults, including programs for all ages, curated book lists for all reading levels, and much more. For more information, visit summerreading.queenslibrary.org.
Good evening. This is Heidi Gelliver, and welcome to Culture Connection. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 11th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. I'm really happy to have with us today Brad Gooch, the poet, novelist, and biographer behind Radiant, the life and line of Keith Haring, whose previous 10 books include biographies about Rumi, Flannery O'Connor, Frank O'Hara, and the memoir Smash Cut. Welcome, Brad. It is great to have you here today, and let's get started.
Hi, great to be here, Heidi.
Amazing. So I just want to say first that I thoroughly enjoyed reading this biography. It's lively. It's really comprehensive. It tells a vivid story about Keith Haring's life in New York City and beyond. And many people may have a general idea about Keith Haring's work, but the sheer volume and scope of it just make it so much clearer in this book. And they give the reader a much clearer picture of what Keith was really all about.
Well, that's good. We like to hear that.
Right? My first question is about the title. So the title Radiant seems like such an appropriate word to describe Keith's personality. The way everyone just seemed to gravitate towards him, like he was just like this glowing soul with a purpose that would lift everyone up around him. And to me, the radiant baby seems to signify the innocence of the human spirit and, you know, that we all try to regain as we get older. Can you talk about how you came to the conclusion that that should be the title, The Life and Line? I just always find it really interesting to understand how authors and filmmakers end up naming their projects.
Yeah, I mean, it kept flipping around in my brain for the 6 or 7 years of this book. But Radiant was always connected with Keith because of the radiant baby. The image of the baby was like his logo, his tag, and he would basically have this comic style, that comic book style, graphic style that he mimicked. And so he had these radiating lines that would come out of his figures, which could show ecstasy or exertion. And so I was partly evoking that, but definitely evoking what you talked about, that there was a radiant quality to Keith's energy. And I think what clicked the whole thing for me was I was talking to Keith's doctor, who was treating him later in his life for AIDS at the end of the 80s. And he said that when Keith would come in the waiting room, so in the 80s, at the end of the decade, there's so many, especially gay guys with HIV, who would be crowded in these doctors' waiting rooms. And he said when Keith would come in, it would sort of light up. And he said it wasn't because he was a celebrity, although he was, but he had this kind of energy. And he said, which I could call radiant for lack of a better word. So, hearing that in this, and then the other context about his life, I thought that was a good choice. I mean, it matched his energy and his spirit. And then calling it The Life in Line is, again, the epigram of the book is Keith saying your line is your personality. And there was a way in which he did about 10,000 works of art in his life. There was a way in which they were one work of art. I mean, he was just constantly drawing 24/7. He was drawing on every kind of surface. And on t-shirts and on canvas and vinyl. So he had an almost continuous sort of line. And I thought that really, again, captured the work and then also something about his personality.
100%. Yeah, I mean, he is just so prolific and had such amazing energy and just never wanted to stop, even, throughout his illness, which I thought was just so brave and so impressive. And he was just so driven, which is amazing. I'm wondering what made you decide to do this book on Keith Haring at the time that you chose to begin the project? Like, why then? And can you describe the landscape at the time around you and in general?
Well, I've been thinking about this book for a few decades. I was in New York at the same time that Keith was. He wasn't my best friend, but there was a few degrees of separation between us. I was living in East Village when he came here in 1978. He was living in First Avenue and First Street. And, I would run across his work. I would run across him. And he was such a scene maker and such a larger-than-life force that it always stayed with me. First is this idea of writing a novel about Keith Haring. Hard to believe now, in the 90s, after he died, there was a period where Boston kind of diminished as figures. I think there was a feeling that the party's over now, and that they had been part of this kind of 80s party scene in some way. And this turned out not to be true, and they have endured. But for a while, I thought of doing a novel, and then when it came time that I had time and space to do such a book, then I just realized that, first of all, the facts of the Guinness Book of Records facts of Keith's life were so startling. I mean, he had a kind of 10-year comet of a career when he goes from East Village gay kid to international art star, and just the pace at which he lived and what happened to him, I thought lent itself to biography. And also that period now is history in a way. So you can't necessarily assume that everyone's going to know what Club 57 was or the Mud Club. Even young queer people don't quite realize what it was like downtown during the AIDS epidemic. So all of this, I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you were breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the main gist of everything that you said. But yeah, I mean, the book does such an amazing job of capturing the feeling of the time spans in New York City. And I think I just love the way the 1978, New York City is described. And I wonder, something that you just touched upon is sort of like, maybe you could paint a little bit of a picture of how things were for Keith as a young gay man in 1976, 97, 77, 78, when he first came to SVA, at a time when the word gay was banned in the New York Times. The Pennsylvania state laws criminalizing same-sex activity were still on the books. I feel like this is something maybe that the younger generation really struggles to imagine or would struggle to imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Keith grew up in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, small town, white town, family, kind of Marine family, and so conservative town, not extreme, and I in Pennsylvania, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and so I remember there was the general atmosphere was beyond don't ask, don't tell. I mean, it was sort of don't ask, don't even think about it. So everyone had this kind of double ledger that they were living with. And Keith was part of that. He went then to Pittsburgh to a kind of commercial art school, which he dropped out of pretty quick. And his parents, but he had a girlfriend for 2 years, Susie, who no one had ever actually talked to Susie before, and she did talk to me, and then we became kind of Facebook friends, and and I could DM her all these questions, and became a great badminton game where I found out a lot and understood a lot more about Keith in that time. In Pittsburgh, he actually begins to come into his own as an artist, discovering things for himself, basically at the Carnegie Museum of Art, and also starts coming out and going especially to a black dance bar in Pittsburgh, and so that's really, he comes to New York then both to go to a real art school, School of Visual Arts, and to come out. And when he hits New York in 1978, this is still the golden age of promiscuity. I called it in the title of one novel I wrote. His father drops him off at the 23rd Street YMCA, which is where some SVA kids were staying. The next day, Keith goes down the street, gets to Christopher Street, calls it like landing in a gay Disneyland, goes to the piers, gets picked up by someone, goes home with him. Guy's living in a kind of commune in the West Village. And that's also his first day at School of Visual Arts. So he's then becomes very much part of the scene of that time, going out to the baths and to bars, and in terms of his art, beginning to draw penises all the time. So kind of coming out to his fellow students at School of Visual Art as a gay artist, which was pretty much the kiss of death at the time. But that was his material, and it was also his life at that moment, coming out.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's just so different. Things are just so different now. So I think this is like just something that I think younger generations would really, get a lot out of reading and learning about.
I think a great difference is we have to keep remembering, even reading the book, we didn't have cell phones. There was no social media. So if you wanted to meet someone, people didn't even have answering machines or air conditioning or
Yeah.
Or you would go out to a club or a bar, and also all the messaging that we're used to is taking place pretty much on the streets, and certainly in the East Village. So I mean, all the walls were covered like with leaflets for rock bands like at CBGB's, or Jean-Michel Basquiat and Al Diaz were doing their SAMO project. So anonymously, we're drawing these crowns and cars and cryptic lines of poetry on the walls. Jenny Holzer was doing her truisms, which is a lot of kind of art political messaging. So it's that kind of excitement and face-to-face confrontation and meeting at that time was very, very important.
Yeah, it's kind of almost like the original social media, I mean, like the walls of New York City and the trains and everything was kind of like, our Instagram.
Exactly. Keith becomes a master of that social media. He's trying to figure out how to fit in to this kind of, sort of visual landscape how to turn his line into a signature. And big moment for him is then he develops his own language, his own alphabet, like these crawling babies and barking dogs and flying saucers that we recognize him by today. And he also starts drawing on the subways, and then this becomes a huge project of his, drawing in chalk on fallow advertising black matte spaces on the subways, and becomes a huge project. He does over 5,000 of these chalk drawings, and and all of that is communicating and messaging to people, and
Right. Yeah.
use all.
There's so much significance in the signs and symbols in Keith's work. It's amazing. I mean, there's one part of the book where you describe how he read Umberto Eco's A Theory of Semiotics, and he did an assignment with his classmate, Frank Holliday at SVA, constructing signs where they deconstructed gay signals of keys on the right, keys on the left, the handkerchiefs, ultra masculine stereotypes. They looked at a scene, and they got intellectual about it. It just makes so much sense to me that Keith would be into semiotics, and just hearing that and understanding, the kind of theory that, you study when you're in art school, it makes perfect sense to me. That he really did create his own language, that started out, with just being so influenced by what was going on in the subway. And I wonder, what kind of an echo that this type of subculture that Keith was so much a part of, what kind of echo does Keith leave today?
Yeah, he has a giant echo. First, I think it was interesting to me, and this is where biography is so beautiful, is you might not really think about what an intellectual Keith was, and how aware he was of what he was doing. I mean, he's almost like a conceptual artist that way. And so he's taking a semiotics class and he's applying it to who he becomes. I mean, this is a point when he's trying to figure out what kind of artist he is. And when he's at SVA, he's doing a lot of video. He's a poet for 6 months and giving readings. And yet one thing that he gets from this class is clarity about developing a visual language of his own. And then he has a show, Club 57, and does these works. In 4 days, he kind of invents the beginnings of that entire alphabet and all those images of his. And then, influenced by William Burroughs and his cut up, he realizes you can put these images together in different ways, as in a comic strip, and you get different stories. So that is part of what he almost figures out, and then he does it. And the other piece that he gets from semiotics is analyzing the art market of the time, very kind of elitist in the way that art gets value the more rare it is, right? And Keith wants to have art for everybody, and he's trying to figure out how you do that. And the subway, drawing in the subways, is a big kind of move for him. And now put those two together and got Keith Haring.
Right. I mean, so he finds this genius way to circumvent the establishment of the art world. And get his work seen and develop an audience, before social media, before Instagram, before all of that stuff. And I guess it also was because of the downturn in the economic situation in New York. Like New York was bankrupt. There weren't a lot of ads. And anytime there was an empty ad, there was just like this empty blank paper there that just, it was just such the most perfect conditions, for somebody like him to sort of come in there and make, just take advantage of that. It just makes so much sense.
Right. And also, performance art at that period, and people gathered around and watched Keith doing these drawings, and then he pretty soon has these pins manufactured with the Radiant Baby on it, and then he hands pins out to people who are on the subway, and then these pins become a kind of cool fashion item in the East and West Village at the time. So Keith never had to go around to gallery dealers with his slides and try to get a show. He developed an audience on his own on the street and in the subway system. So when he finally has his first kind of real Soho show, Tony Shafrazi Gallery, when he's 24 years old, it's carried on the NBC Nightly News with Dan Rather, because it was such a scene and it was a different kind of show. Diego Cortez, who was curator of the also important show at PS1, New York New Wave, at the time, and who died of COVID during all these years I was writing the book, but I did get to talk to him for a few of those years, said to me that when they came to New York in the 70s, the gallery scene was white wine. And so Keith introduces, all of a sudden, hundreds of kids show up at his opening, besides artists like Lichtenstein and Rauschenberg and Clementi, and his boyfriend is DJing in the basement, and he's done sculptures with LA2, who's a teenage like street tag artist, and has created kids who are on the floor coloring. So the whole thing was such a burst, and in that way he found, he had an end run around the system. So he's not only creating that kind of fresh style of art, which is always important, but he was also redesigning the way the system worked, kind of. And that remains, when you're feeling like what's the influence today, a lot of that mission of his, of opening up art for everybody, of public art, of licensing, of community, of drawing on any available surface. These elements were so important to keep. We're definitely feeling an affinity, if not an influence, at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, also like his influences are also discussed in the book, about, like the performance artist, but also, someone like Christo, whose art is just so expansive and can't be really contained. And it really came through that, Keith's art can't really be contained. And he was really all about breaking down all of those boundaries that were there, so he could just, draw on any kind of surface.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's like his dealer, Tony Shafrazi, said to me that Keith was like a sponge, that he would, and indeed, writing this book, it's partly following this kind of sponge, going into all these different things, becomes Europe and the museums and things. It gets larger and larger, but you can see it beginning in Pittsburgh, which people don't know a lot about that before he comes to New York. But you watch the way that he becomes an artist, and is that so much of it depends on what's at the Carnegie Museum of Art. So he becomes he's Alushinsky fan. He was very influenced by Alushinsky. But Alushinsky has a big retrospective at the Carnegie that year. Dubuffet is an important artist for Keith. And Dubuffet talked about. So all those ideas were important, but there was a big Dubuffet in the lobby when you walked in to the Carnegie Museum. There was a documentary about Christo that came out while he was there, and then one of the documentary filmmakers came to a school and he went to the lecture. So he was very much kind of putting together his ideas based on what was happening around him, and that remained true. It's why there's a sense of, Keith was very ambitious, but there was also a way in which he always seemed to be working with the people around him, like this the kind of community. He was always sort of rooted somewhere.
Right. He seems like, just such an extrovert, but such like a happy extrovert, I guess.
He was an extrovert at art. I mean, his actual personality, I mean, it was interesting that people would describe him to me as, and you can kind of see it. There's a video that's on YouTube generally of a New Year's Eve party that he gave, and it was part of the Into 1984 show that Tony Shafrazi, and he had rented out a separate space. So you can watch this whole party, and when you're watching the doorman, he's letting everyone in, and then he's checking in at the bar to see that everyone has a drink, and then he's checking in with the DJ about what music is being played. And so you kind of watch that he's part of this, and he's also not part of it. I mean, he's also always kind of the one who's working, creating a scene.
Right. Yeah. Just really driven. I mean, I missed a little bit of what you said there because it was breaking up a little, but I think I got most of it. But yeah, there's this one part of your book, the image that the book conjures of Keith sitting on a bench in the subway station. And he says you could go down in the subway for 15 minutes at that time and see 50 incredible paintings going by on the trains. And that the train art had a following among SVA students at the time, like with this pop cartoon sensibility influenced by TV and, the scale of the public access and all of that. And it just amazed me. Like, I learned so much about how he was able to interact with that whole community, and he sort of really became a part of it and was very respectful. Like when he met Fab Five Freddy, he, or when he asked Lee Quinones to, if it was okay for him to paint the wall, on Houston Street. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, like his relationship with the graffiti artist community.
Right. No, it's interesting because, I mean, today we have concepts of appropriation and expropriation, and taking from other cultures. But Keith was very aware of that early on, and he he didn't compete in that sense. He always had a sense of place, I guess you would call it. So when he first begins drawing on the street, and everyone's doing kind of graffiti on the walls, Keith pretty much does bases of lampposts. And I guess to be at a certain point, if you want to see Keith Haring, you look down and you're likely to find one at the bottom of the street lamp. He does the same thing then in the subway. He doesn't. He is very influenced. It's like a high moment of the wild style of graffiti when it comes to New York, and that's that on the subway trains, these big double lettering, this acid TV color, kind of de Kooning scale, very exciting. Keith doesn't do that. I mean, he never used a spray can, and he only tried going into the train yards with some friends to try drawing this, spray painting on. Basically left. But so instead, he's working on these panels that no one had ever really noticed. These temporary black matte panels on the subway, and they're in a different. They're like commenting almost on the trains that are going by. So it's all art kid. Way of dealing with that situation. So I think he always had I thought, a appropriate sense of space in terms of dealing with graffiti culture, and and also erotically, he was into mainly Black and Latin guys, and fetishism, objectification that goes into this. But the person who really did that, was Robert Mapplethorpe, who I knew,
Right.
and because his work was about that. I mean, it was taking the different cliches and making shock work about them and commenting on that. Keith really wanted to be part of the community, and he enjoyed going and having Puerto Rican dinner with the parents and the family. So he really liked the family. So there was a kind of aesthetic, uh, method or thing to what he was going on. But there was also like humanity to his relationship, I think, to these guys and to these artists.
Right. I mean, that whole Paradise Garage scene, of it's just like the legendary, most amazing DJs, New York City. I mean, I think that still has a big echo, in New York. And, having him, he was a part of that. And there's, he's just sort of melds right into that melting pot, that is New York City, which is what personally I love about New York City. So I could totally relate to loving that scene so much.
I mean, there's I don't know about now, but for much of the people were coming to New York to become someone that was it was already there in a way, like for my generation, especially like for poets. They were coming to New York because they wanted to be like Frank O'Hara and Allen Ginsberg, and part of it was the freedom of poetry, and part of it was the community, and they seemed to be having such a great time. And likewise with Herring and Kenny Scharf and Jean-Michel Basquiat, they adored Andy Warhol, and he was their art hero, and they wanted to have their own factory in some way. So that kind of was an important I think, for him and for his friends at that time.
Definitely. So yeah, I mean, he was also just so much of an activist, and I think that that's like a definite through line, that you could see throughout the book and also his work, and just going against the elitist ways that the art world, kind of was so impenetrable at the time, and it's easy to forget that now when we look at his work, that at the time that there were a lot of critics that totally just didn't get it. They just misunderstood him.
Oh, completely. And they were also very mean. Robert Hughes was the main art critic at Time magazine, and he really targeted Herring and Basquiat. He called him Keith Boring and Jean-Michel Basquiat case. And so Herring was a disco decorator, so there was a kind of homophobia going on. There was racism, which Keith pointed out, is when Hughes said that Basquiat was the Eddie Murphy of art. And especially the pop shop in Soho. And this is, no artist had opened a store in the 80s, even Warhol. His motive again was partly art for everyone again, that he wanted to sell T-shirts, which he thought of as prints, and his pins, and so everything that was at price points that people the same. Some of this work was selling in galleries for thousands of dollars at that time. So he was trying to do this two-track system, and putting those two wires together for some reason triggered a lot of pushback at the time. That he was a capitalist, that he was selling out. There was an idea that fine art was one thing and commercial art another thing, and they couldn't meet. Warhol had played around with that, especially, and he did some licensing of things, and vodka and wine labels, vodka bottle, Absolute labels. And Keith did that. He did some Swatch watches. But bringing it into a store for some reason then really freaked people out. Like this couldn't be real art. So in a lot of ways, he provoked these sort of serious art critics at the time in his offhand manner, in his, the kind of materials he.
Right. So, like mixing high and low.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, what's the process like of putting together a biography like this? Like, it seems like a huge undertaking, and I wonder, like how long it took you, how many people you interviewed, what were some of the challenges that you came across?
Well, it took me like 6 or 7 years, depending how you count, and I interviewed over 200 people. So, yes, it's kind of epic in that way. I had cooperation from the Herring Foundation, and so I would go in the beginning every few days a week to the Herring Foundation. And and Keith Haring was very bio prepared. I mean, he never threw anything away. He was actually meticulous and tended to sign and date things, and so everything is in the foundation. And if you want to look at his Con Ed bill from 1978, you can. If you want to see his sneakers and his wire rim glasses, everything is intact. And then, of course, all the artwork or reproductions of the artwork and all the telexes, which were the faxes of the time. So there's a lot to go through there. Also, in the COVID was in the middle of this production of mine, so everything had to be then reinvented a little bit. So the foundation very graciously set up these portals for me online, so that they would have all the Haring took 1,200 Polaroids. He had videotapes. I mean, there's all this kind of. It was the 80s. I hadn't dealt with someone from such a recent period, and so we had a lot of visual information, and thousands of images and all of these things. So it was helpful to have that. Also, in terms of interviews, then we kind of switched to Zoom, away from the usual "can I take you to lunch and talk to you" method. So Zoom and phone and DMing on Facebook and all of these things. So there are a lot of different mediums at once. I mean, I was communicating with people in a lot of different ways: WhatsApp and Instagram, lively, appropriately. Also, in terms of interviewing people, I mean, I interview a lot of people just because, first, rightfully in a way, Keith had certain people who were important in his life. I mean, from his family, and then from other artists, especially from SVA, and they become kind of the talking heads of the story of his life. And then writing kind of a big book gives you the opportunity to talk to all the minor characters and who've never been talked to. And they all have stories to tell, and those stories often then gives you a different kind of dimension. It's like making a documentary. That if you as many cameras as you can get on the scene, then it gives you more of a 3D feeling, or an immersive feeling. So that same thing happens with interviewing.
Right. I mean, I'm so glad that you were able to put all that together, while the stories are still alive, and people are still, and still alive in people's memories, because there's so much there that, it can't all really fit into a film. And, it's needed, I think, to have, this kind of record. I'm wondering, like, was your original book much longer? Like, what was your editing process like to try to get it? Did you have to like cut things out that you might have wanted to include?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it happened in the great cutting room inside my head, I think, because I mean, I was aware then that I wanted this book to be about 500 pages, and partly because in, the medium is the message. I mean, partly I wanted it to have just a certain kind of way that almost in itself communicated that now we're going to take Keith Haring seriously as an artist, right? Like he's going to get an artist, a big artist kind of treatment. And in a way, yeah, a lot of the treatment of him has been very flip and fast, as if being made by one of his characters that he was drawing, bopping around. So that was part of it. But you could write a 2,000-page book about Keith Haring. So at the same time, it was constantly throwing things overboard. And there was one part in the book that I did a real one day in the life of Keith Haring, I didn't say this, but just to show what it would be like, if I were documenting it all. And this is a day that he goes to, takes a cab out to the airport, smoking a joint with his assistant and his friend, and they get on a plane, go to Paris, comes into town, leaves his luggage off La Louisiane, this kind of Chelsea hotel, sort of hotel in Paris, goes to have a meeting at the Beaubourg, where he has with him big undone, raw canvas that he's going to use because he's going to be in the show of the important artists of the last 10 years, and he's going to create something for the show. Then he leaves that there. He goes to this pediatric hospital, Hôpital Necker, where he's supposed to, they commissioned him to do a 3-story mural on the outside of this children's hospital. But Keith doesn't work from drawing. There's no pre-drawing. So he has to kind of convince and explain to them how he works and that this is going to be okay, in a sense. So he does that. Then he goes back to the airport. His 2 friends, flies to Germany, gets met and taken to a factory where they're doing a maquette of a big sculpture of Haring's that's going to be done at a sculpture show. He approves of the sculpture, gets back on the airplane, goes back to Paris, and goes to La Louisiane. So that's one day. If I did that, so if I were accurately reproducing the life of Keith Haring, everyone thousands of pages of this, worth doing at least once. But
that's amazing.
part of it is I definitely had to make a lot of decisions about what to include, and in that way, I mean, biography is a genre, but all these genres also collide with each other.
Sure.
And there's something very novelistic, or can be, about biography. It's almost like a 19th century novel. It goes from birth to death, and so I think it was, keeping my finger on the pulse of the forward-moving narrative of Haring's life, and to keep it, meaningful, was how I made those decisions. But they're kind of intuitive.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's certain turning points that will push the story forward, and that are valuable and necessary to say. We also have some photos that we want to show that are inserted into the book. So maybe it'll give us a little bit of visual reference for our audience. And also, if you have any questions that you want to ask, you can certainly put those in the chat, and you can, we will allow for some time towards the end for some questions. So if anyone has any, please go ahead, feel free to ask whatever you want to ask. Okay, so yeah, so these are just a few of the photos that and this one I thought was super interesting because, you know, it's vinyl paint on vinyl tarp. And he, you know, in the beginning, I remember reading that, you know, people wanted him to paint on canvas, but he was, you know, against that because he didn't want to be a traditional painter. So maybe, you know, maybe you have something else you want to say about this one.
Yeah, this was actually in his first show at Tony Shafrazi. Keith didn't like, later in life he did paint on canvas. There wasn't anything finally that he didn't paint on. But earlier on, especially, he didn't like painting on canvas. It was very expensive. It was associated with like a kind of high art that he didn't want to be associated with and didn't feel that comfortable with. And Tony Shafrazi, his dealer, being a dealer, was trying to convince him, like, do real paintings. And so where Keith came out on all this was he was sort of walking down the street one day and saw these plastic tarps that Con Ed would use to cover the sites when they were, you know, the hole in the ground that they made. And he decides to paint on tarp. So he buys tarp, he has his grommets in them, and then in the basement of Tony Shafrazi Gallery, because he didn't have enough space in his studios, these are very big. You know, he would hang these tarps. This was one of them, and so from that first show. And also you see the radiant lines that I talked about, there they are. What do they mean in this painting? I mean, there's certainly love and sexual frisson all in these lines. Also, this was a period when Keith met this black DJ, Juan DeBose, at the St. Mark's Baths. And Juan DeBose, I mean, was very much kind of guy he was looking for. And, you know, they were together for several years, but especially this early time and, you know, this fresh love period created some, you know, this kind of imagery. There's also a big heart in that show, which is when Keith first started using the heart. And I always think of those as being connected to Juan DeBose. It was down playing, down being a DJ during the show, and would also make mixtapes for Keith, and Keith would paint to those mixtapes. Juan DeBose, very much a Paradise Garage guy, as you mentioned. So the connection that Keith had to DJs and to music, in these works.
Such an amazing connection to music, really. I mean, just, you know, the soundtrack is amazing. If you had a soundtrack that would go along with the book.
Yes. Emissions aside, that would be great.
Yeah, right? Yeah. We can go to the next slide.
Okay, so this is Bill T. Jones. And again, I mean, a lot of these show collaboration, which, and I mean, he was always collaborating with people. Bill T. Jones, a dancer, choreographer, originally just from the subway drawings, someone suggested to Bill T. For a poster for an early show of his, oh, why don't you use that guy who's doing all the drawings on the subway? Mm-hmm. And the next question is, who is he? You know, it takes a while to find out. I mean, in those early days, because they were anonymous, like the New York Post had an article and they called him Chalk Man. So part of the excitement also around those early subway works was not knowing who was doing it, and indeed a lot of the street art of the time.
Yeah,
he and Bill T. then do various collaborations. One at the kitchen, where Keith is painting while Bill T. is dancing, and then this, which was done in London, where he paints Bill T.'s body. And Keith always had a kind of neo-hippie aspect to him. He had been a Grateful Dead head and take hallucinogens. So body painting, he was aware of body painting, is a kind of 60s thing. I mean, he reinvents it into almost a kind of Afro-urban kind of imagery here, black and white, and he paints on both Bill T. Jones and Grace Jones' body. But he does this in London in a, about a 4-hour kind of.
Yeah, I was pretty amazed here that he was into the Grateful Dead, but it makes perfect sense because that was his, that was what was going on in culture at the time, so yeah, but
Speaking of the Sponge,
yeah.
also and he also got, I think, from Grateful Dead a certain kind of his marketing ethos a little bit. This art for everybody, and the way Grateful Dead would have T-shirts. I mean, Keith made Grateful Dead T-shirts and sold them, hitchhiking across the country with his girlfriend Susie, and also that they would have those mixtapes and things that they would give out. All that kind of giving away and saturating. I think that Keith almost used that model more than the art world model that was active when he was getting started.
Yeah, super smart.
Yeah.
Next slide.
There we have one of the sculptures. This is a barking dog. This was in Castelli Gallery, so there was a double show of Shafrazi and Castelli. And well, two things you see here. One is that the Castelli Gallery was sort of the church of the period, and there, all these high artists were amazing artists were showing there, like Jasper Johns and Roy Lichtenstein and Rauschenberg and all this pantheon. And Keith, intimidated by that a little bit, then decides to draw on the walls. So he did a kind of live. You see a little bit of that frieze in the background, and he's doing it. I mean, Castelli said he wished he had filmed him because and it is true. One of the most exciting things is if you watch Keith Haring actually drawing. It's a very energetic, interesting performance, and you also see how he has it all in his mind when he begins, or he wouldn't be able to do it the way that he does it. These are all
consciousness or something coming out of him. It's quite amazing.
Right. I mean, that's really what he thought. I mean, in some way, he was always creating without editing, without censoring, without going back and changing. It was almost a kind of Beat Generation aesthetic that he had going on.
Mm-hmm.
And these images you see that he made are all, he had used them when he was in high school and in middle school. So there's a kind of continuity to him, a kind of outsider artist to him, even though he was very sophisticated and very much part of the art world that remains. And then sculpture becomes one of these mediums that he begins to work in. And again, Tony Shafrazi gets some credit here because Keith had made like a little cutout of, I think it was this dog, and Shafrazi was in his studio and he asked what was that, and he said, "Oh, Keith, you should." He was like holding it up, you should try sculpture. He said, like, these figures, you can make them blow them up, and sculpture will last forever, and it endures, and it goes. So all that, of course, caught Keith's interest, and he goes to Lippincott Studios and he makes these very big works, and they take his kind of imagery at that point, and then he does something, and then he works in steel for a while. So this was one of those works.
Pretty amazing how also he wanted these to be for everyone. So like he intended a lot of these, I read that he wanted them to be used by people, in parks, like for shade or to climb on, and he was okay with that. This whole
yeah. I mean, even the show he had his climbing on the sculpture, and there was a kind of tour of grade school kids who came in the afternoon before the opening, and they were climbing all over these. So that was because he always wanted to do a playground, and he never quite got there. I mean, that was one of the things that had he lived, he absolutely would have done.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay.
The closest he did. I mean, he did a Parasite.
I'd be able to see that if he had lived longer, right?
Yeah.
Next slide. There we go.
Okay. And this is then a late work, Pile of Crowns for Jean-Michel Basquiat. So Basquiat, very important in Keith's life, and very much an art buddy of his. The way they met, I mean, Keith had seen these Samo works, which were crowns and cars and lines of poetry, when he first comes to New York on the street, and he didn't know who was doing them, and he was like astonished by this work. He'd always picked out Basquiat, and one day he's walking into School of Visual Arts. This guy says to him, "Oh, would you get me past the security guard? I'm not a student." And so Keith said, "Sure." And they walk in. Keith goes to his class. When he comes out, he sees that the hallways have all been covered with this Samo imagery, and he realizes, "Oh, it's that guy."
Right.
So that's how he meets.
Another story about when this painting was shown, that it somehow did it fall or something, and they said it was Basquiat's ghost.
Yeah, because then they have kind of parallel careers going on. I mean, at a certain point, they're almost like frenemies because they're sort of watching over their shoulders, while admiring each other. And then Basquiat dies of a heroin overdose in this period, in the later part of the decade, where Basquiat dies, Warhol dies, and all these friends of Keith are dying of AIDS. So he makes this painting in honor of Basquiat, and then at the show, at the gallery, it thuds down, falls off the wall, kind of thuds, and Keith said, "Oh, that's Jean-Michel," right? So there's that sense of that he had shown up, and that was Keith knew what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such an amazing story, but also just the pile of crowns, just such a perfect symbol.
Right.
So we can go to the next slide.
This is where we're now into these 1988 works when people are dying. As Keith said somewhere, everyone is disappearing, and he's diagnosed with. He had always sort of suspected that he would eventually develop AIDS because of his lifestyle, because everyone else around him was falling. He does finally get it. I mean, Kaposi sarcoma, red spots begin to appear on him, and that's one of the signs. And then he's officially diagnosed. But at the time, and I mean, instead of it's interesting. It was interesting for me. So I was around at the time. I mean, people had different kinds of deaths under the umbrella of AIDS. I mean, things physically, medically could be very different, and certainly the way that people faced it was a kind of X-ray of character, in a sense. And Herring Way, which instead of this was a period where Rock Hudson was dying of AIDS and refused to admit it, where Donald Trump's lawyer, Roy Cohn, was practically coming back from the grave to say that he had pneumonia or liver cancer or something. Obituaries at the time didn't use the word, didn't give cause of death usually. People seemed to have no personal lives. And instead, Herring does this kind of rock star move, which he gives an interview, big interview, to Rolling Stone magazine, comes out as a PWA, a person with AIDS. and talks a lot about it. And this gives courage to people, and is very helpful. He also he's always been an activist
Right.
for liberation, for issues of race, the issues of the environment, and and in these years then becomes very much an AIDS activist and is important in ACT UP, so that and this is um, an act, he did ACT UP posters, he did Silence Equals Death paintings. Also, the treasurer for ACT UP at the time told me that he used to go to Keith Haring's studio, and Keith would give him these brown paper bags with cash, dollars actually, and Peter Staley would go to the Citibank on LaGuardia and deposit it. This for ACT UP. So he told me that in 1989, about a third of the receipts of ACT UP were covered by Keith Haring, and this was all under the radar. So in these various ways, that was his way of dealing with AIDS, and also in terms of work, instead of melting away, he just revved it all up. I mean, he did more and more and more work. He traveled to more and more and more places. 8 months before his death, he did a giant mural in Pisa, Tutto Mundo, on the side of a Roman Catholic church. 3 weeks before he dies, he does this triptych in Yoko Ono's apartment of The Last Judgment. You could see a Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and in San Francisco and in Paris. So he's working up until the end. I mean, he's in his studio until a few weeks before he dies, or goes into the hospital. On his deathbed, he's drawing these radiant babies and getting increasingly frustrated because he can't complete it. And Kenny Sharp, I think, has the last one of those. So he revealed himself in death and in the facing of AIDS, to be the person he seemed to be. I mean, kind of both inspiring and serious and fun and original. And again, I think setting things up pretty presciently. So in these couple years, these Silence Equals Death years, is when he then he draws up a will and a plan for a foundation, and and he sets up a board of directors. He's in his late 20s, and sets up that, unlike any other foundation, his is devoted half to his promoting his legacy as an artist, and half to giving away money to causes that he cared about, especially around AIDS and young people. And he also specified that they couldn't fundraise. I mean, everything had to come from the sale of his work. And the Haring Foundation has given away over $60 million since then to all these causes. So this kind of double track that he had in his life of art, but also activism and having this kind of public conscience, he set up to. That's the legacy that we're getting. We're getting both of these at once.
Yeah, I mean, he's such an amazing activist and so brave, to do that at the time when he did it, and to come out like that and just be completely honest to the entire public. And I got the sense from reading your book that he knew that it was not going to be easy for him to be that public about it, but he did it anyway, which is amazing.
Right. I mean, he knew it wasn't going to be easy, and also one hesitation he had was he knew that the value of his work would start to go up when people realized that he was facing death, which he thought was a ghoulish, reality, right, of the very art market that he had so tried to bend.
That must have been such a strange thing to have for someone to have to go through. So I'm glad that it's out there and we have, this record of it. I think we can take a couple questions. So there are some questions that popped up in the chat. One from Leslie Frowick. Can you speak about Keith's relation with Warhol? I knew him in New York in the 80s when he was close with Andy.
Oh, great. Yes. I mean, actually, it was surprising to me how close that relationship was. And I mean, I always associate Keith with Andy Warhol and Basquiat, and they're like Mount Rushmore. You see these three together. But doing the book, you could see just the dailiness of it. When Keith and Andy would talk on the phone almost every morning, kind of processing the gossip of the night before. But certainly Warhol was the main influence on Haring in terms of even though they were very different, actually, so that Warhol was dealing with popular culture, but in a kind of ironic way, and Haring, and he was also taking these kind of almost silly images like soup cans and treating them seriously, whereas Haring was using these kind of bright colors but treating various topics often,
Right.
like nuclear radioactivity and gay liberation and AIDS. But he realized that, and he said that there wouldn't be me without Warhol. I mean that he was carrying forward a kind of step. They originally met through Christopher Makos, and who was with Andy a lot, and who Haring had met at the St. Mark's Baths. Also, very important place to meet people, and important in terms of art history and sex and career. He then, so Warhol was at the closing night of the Tony Shafrazi show, and then came to a Fun Gallery show, and then he and Keith gradually become closer, and there's sort of a two-way dynamic with Warhol and then these younger artists, Haring and Basquiat especially, where obviously he's influencing them. He's the old master in his 50s, and but at the same time he's also getting energy from being associated with this young art scene and being part of this young art scene. I mean, you forget, but there's a moment in the Warhol Diaries where he goes to a Keith Haring show, and then he comes uptown and he's saying the next morning, coming up to, that he was sort of depressed coming back in the cab because he was thinking to be when I was on top, like that there were all these kind of energy around these young artists at the time, was very much a kind of 60s energy to Warhol and the way it had been when he was a young artist. So there was a kind of equality, a kind of parity set up between them, and certainly then when Warhol dies, it's one of these crashes for him and Basquiat. So that it's part of what causes a kind of turn in his work too.
Yeah, that's a very interesting symbiotic relationship that they had. That they both sort of fed off of each other. There's another.
I just got invited. I heard about a show in Munich. There's a Haring Warhol show opening in Munich at the end of the month. So there's all these kind of Basquiat Haring shows. And Basquiat Warhol shows and Haring Warhol shows. The kind of synergy remains, or people are picking up on it.
Right. I mean, that's kind of like the ideal of how artists are supposed to interact with one another, right? Like, you know, bouncing ideas off of each other, having a conversation, you know, and it's like they were all having a conversation with one another.
Yeah, and that's part. I mean, I was saying people come to New York to be something, and Herring certainly has that. There's certainly young artists. Part of his success at the moment, I think, is that there's a kind of generation of young artists for whom he's like the Andy Warhol figure right now. And I mean, who are trying to do it. You know, thinking of Kaz, Shepard Fairey, Banksy. They all kind of respect Herring and look to Herring, and actually got a message from Kaz, who I've never met, on Instagram. I was saying that he read my book. And he says, I wish that Keith were around now to talk to. And, you know, there is that sense of that you're trying to think about, you know, what he would make of this moment and what he would make of what other artists are trying to do.
Yeah, it's such a huge loss. I mean, you know, just his life was just cut too short, you know, too quickly. When, you know, I really wish that we could have seen what he would do.
Yeah.
Okay, there's another question here from Richard Alicea. What impact did Patty Astor, co-founder of the Fun Gallery, have on Keith Haring?
Yeah. I mean, she had this great influence. I mean, a great impact's probably the good word. Because Patty Astor was, I mentioned performance art. She was, to me, like a great performance artist in her life, and she was appearing, especially in Wild Style, such an important indie film of that moment, and they all, you know, had these personalities that, like Warhol, were almost cinematic and 2D in a way. They really registered, and especially her. And she then, in terms of getting around the art world, realizes a kind of wish they've been moving toward. So Keith, besides being an artist, I mean, he was a special artist in that he was also a curator. And early on, he would curate shows at Club 57 and the Mud Club. And again, it was showing all his friends. So he had a kind of generosity that isn't always there in artists. And then, you know, Patty Astor picks up on this and starts her own kind of Fun Gallery, which are it, but it really is a gallery for in this kind of mood. I mean, it starts in her bathroom, I think, and then moves somewhere else. And but that kind of vibrancy that I was talking about in the Herring show at Tony Shafrazi, that she really makes a
Right.
And it's all kind of there was and she died recently. The last sort of presence of her I saw there was a review of my book in the New Yorker, and you know, along the way they were you know, trying to decide whether Keith had sold out and whether he was a brand or an artist, and they were vexing themselves about this issue a lot. They were very nice to me, but they seemed obsessed with this. And she wrote a letter to the editor that showed up the next week, and she said, "But you don't understand. We were just having a good time. Like there wasn't a program. You know, people weren't thinking that hard." And I think that's true. She got that spirit of fun, and the way in which that spirit really revived the art world. She was very key in that.
Yeah, I mean, so many of those places were so key, you know, and just, you know, lifting everything up. And it's like a multifaceted thing with the arts and music and all of this, you know, all these things coming together at once, you know, in the culture. So I think there's Let's see if there's one more question. I mean, there's someone that said something about, I'm not sure if this is a question, but it says something about Larry Levan being the main DJ of Paradise Garage. Was he the main DJ? Or there are others, I mean, besides
No, I mean, Larry Levan was very much like the high priest of Paradise Garage, and not a way to just, because people would drive to church. I mean, that was the sense. I mean, there wasn't alcohol, but there was a lot of space for hallucinogenic drugs and mushrooms and things, and so Larry Levan would really lead people, through these moods and on these. And very important to Keith, and he becomes kind of an artist in residence at Paradise Garage. So he was, I mean, it was an age when there were a lot of great DJs in New York City, but he was the greatest, and there were a lot of impressive sound systems. The most impressive, and Larry Levan had this power to break artists open, because if he played a song and it took off and people liked to dance to it at Paradise Garage, that would be an early indicator to producers.
So it was like a testing ground, like a great testing ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So Keith had these yearly parties of life, which were his birthday parties, which in the first few years he gave at Paradise Garage. And at the first one, Madonna sang, and she sang like a virgin. And the song hadn't been released yet. So actually, Bill T. Jones really liked it much because they'd never heard these songs. And he turned to Keith and said, "Who's that singing?" And Keith said, "Well, Andy says she's the next big thing." But Larry Levan was important also, playing Madonna's music singles early on, and people digging in and getting into it. Larry Levan always an important figure to Keith, and his big thrill was when he was finally someone who could be invited up to the Larry Levan's DJ booth, right, and be watching everything from up there.
Amazing, just amazing. Yeah, to be able to do that, it's just like an incredible thing. Okay, so I think one last question, and this is just from Dan Zaleski. Thanks so much for the great book talk. And we sort of already talked about this a little bit, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about Keith's role as an AIDS activist.
Yeah, well, I did mention that he was an activist in two ways, in his life and in his art. And in his art, by doing, which no one else was particularly doing as art on canvas, ACT UP slogans and silence equals death. And he's also doing posters and giving money. He was also, and by being the most public person about AIDS, by doing the Rolling Stone interview that I mentioned. And he would also take part in the ACT UP actions. So he was part of the St. Patrick's action, famous. This went inside who were Catholic, and went up to communion, and then started shouting "ACT UP," and so that particular action he was at, and so I think in all these ways, that was almost the culmination of the activism, and it was kind of one-person safe sex campaign. He had first done one of these, or early on, done one of these in Vienna, one of his safe sex penis things, and then the police came up, as in his early days in the subways in New York, and stopped him, and he had to change the penis into a snake, although he said everyone knew what it really was. And then at the pop shop, he was selling condom cases, Keith Haring condom cases, and giving them away, and very much alive and alert at that time.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, he's just still such a force, even though he's not with us anymore, unfortunately, but he's still such a force in culture, even now, and so I think it is really timely, time to have this book out in the world, because it's just, I guess around that 30-year mark, or whatever you want to say, where people sort of start to finally understand the artist, and maybe a lot of the misunderstandings are sort of washed away, and you're left with more of the essence. So yeah,
and we need Keith. I mean, just the way in which his activism. I mean, that he would during these Reagan elections, especially the 1984 election, when it seemed a foregone conclusion that Reagan was going to be elected, and Keith kind of turned his whole subway gallery over to draw anti-Reagan chalk drawings and get out the vote drawings. So he never felt powerless. I mean, he took things on, wherever he was, and in whatever fashion. And it's amazing how much some of it has really blown up. And so that's hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, there's this through line, of activism in his work, from the very early beginnings of it, right up until the end. So yeah, it's really an amazing artist. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I really enjoyed it. And, just get out there and read that book, because it's amazing. So I'd highly recommend it as a great read. Thanks so much.
I enjoyed it. It was great. Thank you. Bye. My little